Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we are going to be tackling a topic that seems like it's been everywhere lately, globalization.
It really has, hasn't it?
It feels like everyone has an opinion on whether it's dead or dying or maybe just transforming before our very eyes. But to get to the bottom of it all, we're going to need to go beyond the opinions and look at some data.
Absolutely. And for that, we're going to be relying on a very interesting report. The 2024 DHL Global Connectedness Report.
Okay, so what exactly is this DHL report?
Well, think of it as a detective for all of the world's connections. Trade, money, information, and even the movement of people.
So it's tracking all of the ways that countries and people interact with each other.
Exactly. It's a really comprehensive look at how interconnected the world is.
So let's dive right in. What does the report actually say about the state of globalization?
Well, this might surprise you, but the report says globalization didn't shrink.
Yeah. In fact, it hit record highs in 2022, and it stayed strong in 2023. The Global Connectedness Index, which measures how much of all activity is international, peaked at 25%.
Hold on. So globalization is actually booming. I have to admit, I thought it was going the opposite way.
Yeah, that's a really common thought. A lot of people are talking about deglobalization these days, but the report makes a point of saying that the world is actually much less globalized than most people think.
Okay.
That 25% figure means we're closer to having no international activity than we are to a world without any borders.
So are we all overreacting to this deglobalization everyone's talking about?
It's possible. The point is that globalization wasn't as widespread as we thought, so even a small shift away from it could have a bigger impact than we realize.
It's interesting. It makes you wonder if we've overestimated globalization's impact.
Yeah.
Both the good and the bad, because we thought it was more powerful than it actually is. Something to think about for sure. Now let's look at trade, one of the classic ways we measure globalization. What does the report say about that?
Well, the data there is a bit complicated. The usual measure we use, the global exports to GDP ratio, rebounded in 2022, but then slowed down again in 2023.
So it's bouncing around a bit. What's causing these ups and downs? Does the report go into more detail?
Yeah, it does. The report shows that the actual volume of goods traded went down in late 2022 and still hasn't fully recovered. And another interesting thing is that trade intensity, which measures how much of what a country produces is traded internationally, well, that's highest for mining.
Interesting.
And in general, more goods are traded than services.
So physical stuff is still crossing borders more than things like services. What about all the online shopping we do these days? It seems like people are buying from all over the world.
You're right on the money with that. That's one of the positive trends in the report. Cross-border e-commerce is expected to grow by a huge 20% each year until 2028. That's definitely something to keep an eye on.
Absolutely. Okay, let's talk about the U.S. and China. That relationship is always in the news. What does the report show about that? Are these two economic giants disconnecting?
Well, it's actually more nuanced than a simple disconnect. The report shows that since 2016, the share of flows between the U.S. and China has dropped by about 25%.
Okay.
So while they are focusing less on each other, their connection is still stronger than almost any other pair of countries in the world.
So it sounds more like a strategic shift than a complete breakup.
Exactly. It's more of a rebalancing than a complete decoupling. And we see a similar pattern with Russia after the invasion of Ukraine. Its international connections have changed drastically. But the report doesn't show any big splits happening between groups of rival countries.
So the world isn't dividing into these separate economic blocks, at least not yet.
Right, not yet. But what of this idea of regionalization?
Yeah.
Is globalization becoming more regional?
That's a good question. There's been a lot of talk about nearshoring and friendshoring lately.
You're right, it's a popular idea. But despite all that talk, the report doesn't see a widespread shift toward regionalization. Most international flows haven't gotten shorter in distance.
So the world isn't just breaking up into little regional bubbles?
Not entirely, no. There is one big exception, though. Trade in goods within North America did become more regional in 2023, probably because of those nearshoring efforts you mentioned.
So regionalization is happening, but it's not happening everywhere. Okay, what about the human side of globalization?
Right.
Are people still moving and connecting across borders like they did before the pandemic?
Well, the report shows that information flows, especially online, have grown the most in the last 20 years. But the newest data suggests that might be slowing down.
Interesting. Is that because more and more countries are making rules about data?
It's possible. It's something researchers are watching closely. People flows, on the other hand, were really hurt by the pandemic.
Yeah, it makes sense.
But they are recovering strongly. International travel is almost back to pre-pandemic levels. And the report has a really interesting fact. More countries allow visa-free travel now than ever before.
That's really good to hear. So, as the world is opening up again, people are ready to reconnect. I'm curious about which countries are leading the way in globalization. Are the usual suspects at the top? You know, the US, China, those big economies?
Well, not necessarily. The report actually debunks the idea that size automatically means global reach.
Okay.
The most globally connected country is, get this, Singapore.
Wow, I wouldn't have guessed that. What makes them so connected?
Well, they have the biggest international flows compared to their domestic activity. The Netherlands and Ireland are second and third, and they're also known for being globally connected. Interestingly, the UK leads in how far its connections reach geographically, which is probably a result of its historical ties all around the world.
So it seems like a combination of strategy and history plays a big role in global reach. Okay, let's pause here and think about what we've learned so far.
Sounds good.
Globalization is a lot more complex than the simple stories we hear. It's not dead or dying, but it's definitely changing in some interesting ways. And it's a lot less widespread than we often assume.
Yeah. And that actually brings up a really interesting question. I keep thinking about that 25% globalization figure. It really changes how we should think about this whole topic. If globalization is already limited, should we be focusing on something else?
What do you mean?
Well, instead of arguing about whether globalization is good or bad in some absolute way, maybe we should accept the level of connection we have and figure out how to make the most of it.
I see what you're saying. It's less about worrying that globalization is disappearing and more about using what we already have in the best way.
Exactly. One of the most fascinating things about this report is how it challenges our assumptions about globalization. We often hear these grand narratives about a world becoming either totally connected or completely isolated, but the reality, as the report shows, is much more nuanced.
It is, right. It's like we're always focusing on the extremes, either embracing a completely borderless world or retreating into ourselves. But what if the best path lies somewhere in the middle? What if the real opportunity is to use the interconnectedness we already have in a way that benefits more people and creates sustainable growth?
That's such a thought-provoking idea. Instead of getting caught up in those extreme positions, we could be asking ourselves, okay, this is the level of connection we have. How do we make it work best for everyone?
Exactly. So how do we actually do that? How do we optimize the benefits of globalization, given that it's limited? Does the report offer any guidance on that?
It does. It doesn't lay out a step-by-step plan, but it highlights some key areas we should consider. Remember how we talked about trade intensity being different for various sectors? Well, that's a good example. If we want to promote trade effectively, we need to tailor our policies to the specific needs of each industry.
So a one-size-fits-all approach to trade policy might not be the best strategy.
Right. What works for the mining industry might not work for the services sector, and vice versa. We need to be more strategic and nuanced in our thinking.
And businesses also have a responsibility here, don't they? It's not just about government policies.
Absolutely. Businesses have a crucial role to play in shaping the future of globalization. The report's findings on cross-border e-commerce, for instance, show how important digital platforms and technologies are becoming in facilitating international trade.
So companies that can effectively leverage those tools are likely to be more successful.
Exactly. They'll be better positioned to thrive in an increasingly interconnected marketplace. And as we talked about earlier, consumers also have a role to play. By being more mindful of our consumption choices, we can influence global trade patterns.
It all comes back to individual choices, doesn't it? Globalization isn't just something that happens to us. It's something we actively participate in. Now, what about the flow of capital? Did the report highlight any interesting trends in international investment?
It did. While overall foreign direct investment, or FDI, has been a bit sluggish, the report found that announcements of greenfield FDI projects and international mergers and acquisitions have remained strong.
That sounds a bit contradictory. What's driving that trend?
It's actually quite interesting. While some companies might be hesitant to make large-scale investments right now, given all the uncertainty in the global economy, others are actually looking for opportunities to expand their operations and diversify their supply chains.
So they're taking a more strategic, long-term approach to investment.
Exactly. They're recognizing that in a world that's becoming more interconnected, Resilience and adaptability are key to success.
And this ties into the report's findings on information flow as well, right? We talked about how the overall growth of information flows might be slowing down, but there are still areas where strategic collaborations are flourishing.
You got it. International scientific research collaboration is a prime example. While it's facing some headwinds, particularly with the reduced collaboration between the U.S. and China, it still holds immense potential.
It's fascinating how these different aspects of globalization, trade, investment, information flows are all interconnected and influence each other. It really paints a picture of a complex, dynamic system.
It does. And it underscores the importance of taking a holistic view of globalization and recognizing that the choices we make in one area can have ripple effects across others. For instance, those restrictions on data flows that we discussed earlier, they could have a real impact on international collaboration, including scientific research.
That's a great point. It highlights the interconnectedness of these issues and how decisions made in one area can have unintended consequences in others. It's a reminder that we need to think carefully about the potential impacts of our choices and strive to find solutions that create a more balanced and sustainable global system.
Absolutely. It's about finding ways to harness the power of globalization while mitigating its risks and ensuring that its benefits are more equitably distributed.
Speaking of benefits, I'd love to dive a bit deeper into the human side of globalization. We briefly touched on international travel and migration, but I think it's worth exploring further. After all, it's the movement of people that truly brings the world closer together.
I completely agree. And the report provides some really interesting data on this front. As we discussed earlier, international travel was hit hard by the pandemic, but is rebounding strongly.
That's encouraging to hear. What about migration flows? Did the report offer any insights into how they've been impacted by recent events?
It did. The report notes that while the pandemic may have temporarily disrupted migration patterns, the long-term drivers of migration, things like economic opportunity, conflict, and climate change, remain strong.
So we can expect international migration to continue to be a significant factor in shaping global demographics and cultural exchange.
Absolutely. And this raises some important questions about how we manage these flows in a way that is both humane and sustainable. How do we balance the needs of migrants with the concerns of host countries? How do we ensure that migrants are treated fairly and have access to opportunities?
Those are complex issues with no easy answers. But I think the report's findings point to the need for more nuanced and compassionate approaches to migration policy, policies that recognize the contributions migrants make to our societies and economies, while also addressing legitimate concerns about security and integration.
Exactly. It's about moving beyond simplistic narratives and developing policies that reflect the complexity of human mobility.
And that recognize the human element at the heart of globalization.
Precisely.
You know, as we've been talking, I've been thinking a lot about that 25% globalization figure. It really does challenge our assumptions about how connected the world actually is.
It does, doesn't it? It's a reminder that while globalization is a powerful force, it's not as all-encompassing as we sometimes imagine. And that perhaps, instead of focusing on whether it's expanding or contracting, we should be thinking more about how to make the most of the connections that already exist.
That's such a crucial point. It's about shifting our focus from the quantity of globalization to the quality of globalization. How can we make those existing connections more meaningful, more beneficial, more equitable? That's the real challenge, and I think that's where the true potential lies.
I couldn't agree more. It's about moving beyond the binary debates about globalization and embracing a more nuanced and strategic approach. An approach that recognizes the complexities of our interconnected world and seeks to leverage those connections to create a more prosperous and sustainable future for all.
As we wrap up our deep dive into this report, I keep coming back to that idea of maximizing the benefits of the connections we already have. It feels really practical, especially after seeing all this data about how globalization actually works.
It is practical.
Yeah.
And I think it's a really important shift in perspective. Instead of getting stuck in these ideological debates about globalization as a whole, we can start asking more targeted questions like, how do we make sure these existing flows of goods, money, and people are working well for everyone?
Yeah, it's like we've been so worried about the ship changing course that we haven't focused on how to make the most of the journey we're already on.
That's a great analogy. And think about what that means for how we approach these issues. Instead of just reacting to fears about deglobalization, we could be proactive.
So what would that look like in practice? What are some concrete steps we could take to optimize those benefits you mentioned?
Well, take trade, for example. If we know that certain sectors are more reliant on global trade than others, our policies can be designed to support those sectors specifically. Maybe that means targeted investments in infrastructure or worker training, or perhaps it's about streamlining regulations to make it easier for businesses to operate across borders.
So a more tailored approach instead of a one-size-fits-all solution.
Exactly. And the same principle could apply to other areas of globalization. For instance, when it comes to international investment, we could focus on attracting investments that align with our broader social and environmental goals. Think about green technologies or projects that create decent work opportunities.
That's a great point. It's about being more deliberate and strategic in how we engage with globalization, right? Not just letting it happen, but shaping it to work for us.
Absolutely. And remember, optimizing the benefits isn't just about economic gains. It's also about fostering international cooperation, promoting cultural exchange, and tackling shared challenges like climate change.
It's about recognizing that interconnectedness isn't just about economic efficiency, but also about building a better world together.
Exactly. And that brings us back to that final thought-provoking point you mentioned earlier.
Right, I love how you framed it. If globalization is already limited, does that actually give us more leverage? It almost seems counterintuitive.
It does seem that way, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But think about it this way. When we're dealing with a massive, complex system, it can feel overwhelming to try to control it.
Like trying to steer a giant ship in a storm.
Exactly. But if we acknowledge that the system is already constrained in certain ways, it becomes a bit more manageable. We can focus our efforts on making targeted adjustments that have a bigger impact.
So it's almost like accepting the reality of limited globalization gives us a new sense of agency.
I think so. It allows us to shift from a reactive mindset to a more proactive one. We can move beyond those fears of deglobalization and start asking ourselves, what are the specific things we can do to make the most of the interconnectedness we have?
That's such a powerful shift in perspective. Instead of feeling powerless in the face of these massive global forces, we can start to see ourselves as active participants in shaping a more connected and beneficial future.
And that's what I find so exciting about this report.
Yeah.
It doesn't just present a bunch of data. It challenges us to think differently about globalization and to explore new possibilities.
Well said. So for our listeners who are feeling inspired to learn more and dive deeper into these ideas, where can they go?
The full DHL Global Connectedness Report is a fantastic resource. You can find it for free online. Just search for DHL Global Connectedness Report 2024. It's packed with insights and analysis that can really help us understand these complex global dynamics.
It's like a roadmap for navigating this interconnected world we live in. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and a special thanks to you for sharing your incredible insights.
My pleasure. It's always a fascinating conversation.
Until next time, keep diving deep, stay curious, and remember, the future of globalization is what we make it.